Center ourselves, oh God, as we move now into a time of study with the book of Romans. What we pray is for it to be applied into our life. So leverage our time, the readings, the listening, the questions, all in such a way that is used to help form the nature of Christ inside of us. And we pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so Romans chapter 11. And keep in mind, chapters 9, 10, and 11 are part of a core argument, which is the last of the theology side of the book of Romans. Romans is divided from chapter 1 to chapter 11. It has more to do with theology of things, particularly with what now because of Jesus Christ. Chapters 12 through the middle part of chapter 15 has to do with, because of all this theology, now what does it mean for people? Or what does it mean for the church that is in Rome? So Paul is writing to these people that he's never met, hopes to visit one day, but he's really trying to work on the relationship between the Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians that exist inside of that particular church. And that it wasn't something that was only a struggle for Romans. When you read the book of Acts, you know that in any of the churches that was an issue that he addressed in other areas, but primarily in Romans. When we get to chapter 8, or when we got to chapter 8, chapter 8 has to do with sort of this climax of now that Jesus' death and resurrection. What does that mean? That means no condemnation. That's how chapter 8 begins for those who are in Christ Jesus. It ends with the idea of the work of the Spirit. So not only are people who are followers, who are believers in Jesus Christ, not only is there no condemnation for them, they also now have this work of the Spirit that will bring about transformation inside the life of the person. And there's nothing that can separate that work. I mean, the last part of chapter 8 is all the what ifs of, is there ever a reason why this would be a deal breaker? And from Paul's perspective, there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. 9 and 10 and 11 have to do with, okay, in light of that, what now for people of the Old Covenant? Does that mean the Old Covenant is null and void? Does that mean that God just writes the Old Covenant off and just goes to New Covenant? How are all those reconciled together? And 9 and 10 9 and 10 we've looked at in previous weeks, and what we ultimately get to is that Old Covenant struggles have opened the door for New Covenant possibilities, which then will open the door for Old Covenant to be looked at again. All right, if that makes sense. And that all of this is part of what we call salvation history. The line of salvation that shows up between the covenants. When we get to chapter 11, Paul he concluded his arguments in 9 and 10 with a picture of God holding out his hand to a disobedient and a stubborn Israel who constantly refuses him. Now that's general language, not everybody inside of Israel. And in chapter 11, he focuses on God still holding out his hand. And in the end, now we don't know exactly when the end will be. There's a lot of debate on that. Israel's infidelity will be overcome by God's own faithfulness. That's how 11 plays out. And so we're going to look at that, and definitely not going to get through the whole chapter today. But one of the things I want you to sort of keep in the back of your mind throughout this lesson and in the weeks to come, the backdrop behind all of this is God's mercy for all parties. Whether it be Old Covenant, whether it be New Covenant, whether it be Israel, whether it be Gentile, does not matter. Behind it all is God's mercy. Paul escapes this logic of Israel's permanent rejection by talking about God's wrath vanishing, and that this idea of Old Covenant promise reappearing, and the reason behind all that is that God is merciful, and that God's goodness will overcome in the end. Now, what that means in chapter 11 is that Israel is savable, precisely because God is merciful. Now, what I did today is to give you some connection pieces between what we've looked at in the past in 9 and 10, and how those same themes, in it might not be the same wording, shows up in chapter 11. And so you can see the corresponding parts to what we've looked at through 9 and 10, and how that plays out in chapter 11. So chapter 11, the reason I tell you this is that you see this consistent argument on behalf of Paul about how mercy as the backdrop, and that inside of God's will and God's desire for people to be redeemed, for people to be saved, for people to be whole. Those words are used interchangeable inside the New Testament. You see that all this is an act of God. It's an act of God's mercy. It's an act of God's care. That this is God's default state. Now, that's my terms, right? His default state is not one of judgment and punishment. His default state is one of mercy and grace. This is where God starts. And it's something that God constantly resurfaces back. Now, you can play that. So take out the book of Romans and now insert your own life. I would argue that's probably has been your experience of God as well. I've asked the question a couple times. I'll ask it again right now. How many of us have gotten it right all the time, or been perfect all the time, or either just been perfect since becoming a Christian?
How about since we got out of bed?
Yeah, or from how about in the last 2 minutes? What is true of Old Covenant and New Covenant, what is true of Abraham up to Shane, all right, or wherever you want to start to wherever you want to end, is that if you took the best 15 seconds of anybody's life, just the best 15 seconds of their life, and you laid that up against God's holiness, it still pales in comparison. So none are without guilt. None are without blame. None are without anything other than, if it's not God's mercy behind it all, we're kind of all in the same boat. This is the argument of Paul. And so he's talking specifically about Israel, Old Covenant, and Gentiles into New Covenant, and how that all reconciles with God's goodness, God's grace and mercy. And whatever we think of 9, 10, and 11, whether you like it or you don't like it, I would argue that we should all be thankful, because if this is not part of how God operates, then God becomes arbitrary. Who wants to belong to a God that can just change his mind and say, well, I know you thought you were in, but you're not? Seriously. Or you're in if you can be obedient, but the moment you are disobedient, you're out of the club. Right. So there's part that says, wow, thank you. Because all of us can agree with Augustine. Augustine, one of his famous little prayers or statements is, looking at someone who it was a notorious sinner, there but by the grace of God go I. Now, I mean, so there's and at the same time, one of the struggles that exist inside the church at Rome, at least from the Gentile perspective, now as being, when we get into chapter 11, you're going to see Paul talk about a new branch or a wild branch grafted into the olive tree. Is this idea of you had your shot, you missed it, now we've got our shot, so get out of the way. I mean, that's also a temptation that sits throughout any time and period. I mean, one of the great things about studying church history, and that might or might not be your favorite topic, but it's worth at least reading and giving a glance towards, is whenever there are aspects of renewal inside the church or reform, and they happen all the time. I mean, we like to talk about the Protestant Reformation as being one of the major ones, but there are all types of reforms that exist all throughout the church, throughout the history of the church. One of the characteristics of reform is that when those who were either oppressed or those who are the reformers because something is not working, when they get the lead or when they have the influence on the power, at least for the first little bit, when I mean little bit, it might be 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, it normally doesn't end well. Because now they call the shots. And they actually reinvent what they were trying to reform. And that's true inside the church. It's true outside the church. French Revolution, I know you probably didn't sign up for a history lesson today, but the French Revolution is a perfect example of that. Or Reconstruction after the Civil War. Go back to your American history. It's interesting how we just, as human beings, we reinvent what we're even trying to stop or change. And it's, when people have power and influence, that can be a huge temptation. And one of the great chapters in all the Bible, I think it's John 13. This is when Jesus is in the upper room, and before he washes the disciples' feet, there's right at the very beginning, maybe it's like verse 5 or 6 or something, where it says, when Jesus knew that all authority was given to him, he gets up, takes on the mantle of a servant, and he washes his disciples' feet. All right, so just think about that. What happens when you know you are the top dog in the room? What do you do? Do you serve, or do you make others serve?
It reminds me of the first time I saw my first child as he was born. And it was not until that moment I looked at him and I thought, I'm completely responsible for him.
Right.
How can he lie? I mean, he can't do anything.
Yeah.
It was a very humbling
Sure.
time. So I think what you're saying.
Well, what you could do then is you could say, well, I gave you life. Good luck to you. Yeah, exactly right. Or the idea of a sustaining presence, a submission type idea. But it's I think is it? Am I right, Becky? Are you looking that up? Is it John chapter 13? I hope it is. Okay. If it's not John chapter 13, I promise you it's in the book of John. How about that? So can anybody dispute that? No, I'm just. But it's in the upper room, high priestly type prayer type that goes on for about 4 or 5 chapters in the book of John. But it gives you insight into the nature of God, which brings us back to Romans chapter 11. Mercy is the default, and people who are merciful, people who are graceful. You find it?
13:6.
Oh, what's that? I'm sorry. Didn't I say 5 or 6? I'm just saying. It's just kind of, Yeah, that's exactly right. So, anyways, but you do see that the default place for God is one of merciful, one of graceful, and that type of attribute of God, and I would argue then that type of characteristic inside of a person would be in line with John 13:6. That real influence and power is not lording over as much as it is serving. So you have God who's dealing with this old covenant, new covenant, and Paul has given us insight into how he deals with it. So let's look real quick at 1 through 5, and then we'll take a break. So if somebody would read 11, 1 through 5, and we'll kind of go through this real quick. All right, so Paul is I was summarizing what Paul was stating, and that this soft remnant, I think he calls that either remnant Israel compared to ethnic Israel back in 9 and 10, chapters 9 and 10. But this soft remnant exists inside the larger scope of Israel. I mean, who was Paul before the Damascus Road? Jew or Gentile? Jew, and yet he's a believer. I mean, that's proof that all have not been rejected. And there are others. I mean, the New Testament is filled with a number of Jews who become Christians. Actually, the first, thousands of Christians, they were all Jews. I mean, Gentiles don't come in until about midway through the book of Acts. I mean, all the disciples, when they first preach, they preach in synagogues, they preach in the temple, they preach in areas that would have been populated, they would have been part of Jewish population. And so the beginnings of the church is not Gentile oriented. You don't get to the Gentile part until, I think it's Acts 10 with Cornelius. The idea that God cannot unknow the people that he already knows. Well, you go back to Romans chapter 8. I mean, there's nothing that separates people from the love of God because God's default state is one of mercy. Paul, now he references, all through 9, 10, and 11, it's a throwback to a bunch of Old Testament. And now keep in mind, he quotes so many different parts of the book of Old Testament, and they're out of context. Now, we read something, we read it out of context, and there's a little bit inside of us that the hairs on the back of our neck begin to stand up to say, gosh, you're manipulating the text. That was appropriate for teachers back then, particularly in light of Paul reinterpreting Old Testament passages through now the lens of Christ. I mean, that would have been, that's a common practice, so Paul's in line with all others, Christians or not, teachers. I mean, Greeks, the whole 9 yards. I mean, it didn't matter if it was religious teaching or not. That's something that teachers did. So he references Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. And you remember that, maybe remember that. You got Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab's king marries Jezebel, which is northeast up into, would be the Phoenicians in the modern day Lebanon. And they get married, and with that, Jezebel brings her old worship structure and system. Ahab just kind of throws do whatever you need to do, and so she sets up all these adjoining worship spaces on Mount Carmel that were also just right beside some of the worship spaces for Yahweh, for Jehovah. And so what that created was a syncretism of religious activity where you could worship Yahweh, and then you could go a few feet over and you could worship Baal. You could go a few feet over and you could worship Asherah and all these other deities. And so Elijah's a prophet. has this showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and it's a drought. I mean, you might remember that from 1 Kings 19. And but eventually, they make the two altars. One altar doesn't light, the other altar lights, and Elijah and some of the people, they actually go and kill all the priests of Baal, and they chase them down the hill. Well, Elijah just sort of checks out, really. I mean, psychologically, he's depressed. I mean, he's been running on empty for so long, and so he's depressed. He runs down the mountain. He sees Obadiah, and Obadiah says, "Where are you going? You know, we just won. Let's kind of finish the game." And Elijah goes, "No, it's all gone to pot. It's terrible, and I'm the only one who's faithful." Well, he's talking to Obadiah. Obadiah is faithful too, and Obadiah says, "Well, now wait a minute. I got all these thousands of priests. These faithful people. They're just hiding in the caves from all the authorities. So, you're not the only one." So, Paul reinterprets that whole passage and talks about how, there is a remnant that was saved then. There's a remnant that was saved now. Now, one of the things that happens inside the church, whenever we talk about a remnant, it has a lot to do with glass half empty or glass half full. So you could say of the whole, only a remnant survived. That sounds bad, doesn't it? So in a room this size, what's a remnant? Give me a number. 5, right? So 5 of y'all are going to make it. The others are not, all right? So just happen to be you're one of the 5, so don't worry if you're not, but only 5 are going to make it. And so one thought could be, gosh, what about the others? I don't know how many people we got in here, maybe 40. So we've got 35 who won't. That sounds bad, right? But if all should make it, and yet 5 do make it, well, that's a different way of looking at it. Does that make sense? And so, so if mercy is the backdrop, at least a remnant is saved when no one should be. All that is an act of grace. Verse 5 and 6. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace, but if it is grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. No one deserved it, yet there is a remnant, the salvation history that we see, and for that we give thanks. All right, 1 through 5. Let's take a break. 10 minutes and then we'll kind of regather again. All right, we'll come back together and anything that looked unclear or something of question in verses 1 through 6.
Shane, in my Bible, I've got a footnote that I wrote in that somebody said one time at verse 6, if they could be made God's people by what they did, God's gift of grace would not really be a gift.
Right.
Have we seen that again?
So there's, could you say that one more time, just for everybody?
If they could be made God's people by what they did, then God's gift of grace would not really be a gift.
Right. And you could make they as in anyone. I mean, if anyone, yeah. So if you think back to, not sure exactly what chapter it is in the book of Romans, I want to say it's in the 5, 6, and 7 part where we're talking about covenant with Abraham, covenant with, then with Adam, and some of the issues that were the whole issue of mentioning Abraham is that Abraham is considered righteous in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. All right, Old Testament from the book of Genesis, New Testament, the Hebrew writer picks up on that and near the end of the book of Hebrews. Both say that Abraham's righteousness was an act of faith, not circumcision. Circumcision is a result of being faithful, but circumcision is the code word for what he did. So Abraham is righteous because of believing in God's grace. A functioning of that is circumcision. So part of what you have in your footnote is definitely in line with verses 5 and 6, but it actually harkens back to another part of the book of Romans 2, where we were talking about this whole issue around Abraham and what does it mean to be righteous? Does righteousness come from something that is given because of Christ, or does righteousness come because it's something earned because a person does it? And so Paul would argue that first it is a gift that is given, that is applied to the person via faith. With that comes actions, but the actions are secondary. And to Susan's point, if salvation or righteousness could come from action, then there is no need for Christ, which then there is no need for grace, because grace is a gift when there is a space between. It takes the space between and makes it whole. You know, if my righteousness is only here, but what's required is there, well, I got to have something that bridges the gap. Well, the way we talk about what bridges the gap is God's grace. So good footnote. So is that your footnote? Do we footnote you now? Do we cite you in the future? So that's Susan Middlebrooks. The date is, you can make your notes in your own Bibles if you want. All right, so let's look. Are any other comments or questions about 1 through 6? Anything that
Circumcision, is that to the Jews?
Yeah, circumcision.
Baptism is to the Christians.
Yes, but in Old Testament, circumcision a little more definitive than baptism in the New Testament. But both of them are rites of passage and would be considered sacramental, that God is involved in it. So good analogy there. So when we talk about circumcision, it's not just the act of the male child or the male adult. Sometimes it was adult circumcision. That was in a world that had, in the ancient world, there were a number of folks uncircumcised. Then there were a number of other religions had different parts of circumcision. We're all adults in here, so some of them were partial circumcisions, some of them were quarter circumcisions. circumcision for Abraham was 100%. So in a world that didn't dress the way we do, where a lot of modesty and whatnot, it's more open in that day. I mean, you could figure out real quick who had been circumcised and who had not. All right, I mean, it's just different world. Okay, I mean, it's it's just different world that you lived in compared to today. I mean, we're heavy influenced from Victorian England. I mean, whole Puritans inside the United States, and so we live with that level of causation. In the ancient world, it was not there. I mean, sexual activity is considered private today. It was public back then, very public. It was even an aspect of worship in pagan areas. I mean, one of the ways that you worshipped is you sacrificed. You went down and you gave your animal or whatever to be sacrificed for whatever purpose. The other one was that you would go and have sex with either a male or female temple person. I mean, that was either way. I mean, both of those were received. Now, what separates Judeo-Christian worship practices still have sacrifice, just no sexual relations. I mean, it's just, now again, listen, we look at it from our perspective. So, I mean, and I'm glad for that, all right, but from the ancient world, very common, very common. I mean, polygamy was the rule. I mean, so read the Old Testament. I mean, seldom do you have one man, one woman. I mean, it's one man, multiple women. That was also true in Rome. The idea of marriage between one man, one woman comes very late, and then and for hundreds of years, it's arranged marriages. I mean, the idea of marrying for love is very late. Like, I think it's only like 150, maybe 200 years old. So, I mean, there's a good book on there. It's called The History of Marriage. Can't think of the author. I think I got it in my library. It's maybe in a box somewhere. When we moved off the district, some of my books never made it out of the box. They're going to be buried under our house one day. But actually, it's a big volume that just traces the history of marriages. But you've got the footnote. But our understanding of marriage, as in one man, one woman, and the idea of marrying for love, is very late in the game compared to the history of marriage itself. But even in the Old Testament, I mean, can you even name one person, one male that just had one wife? No. And I mean, so the default in the Old Testament is polygamy, and in the New Testament, you have a little bit of that. You have a little bit of one man, one woman, and then you have a little bit of this, ascetic view of marriage, which is abstinence, or just no marriage, do whatever you want. I mean, you kind of get a little bit. Corinthians is a good book to study for that, around chapters 8, 9, and 10, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's our understanding with that is, as in compared to the history. When I say our understanding, I mean our day and time is it's very late. So I mean that it is what it is. I'm not trying to make a judgment on either way. I'm just giving the history of it. I see a lot of stern faces. All right. So I mean, so obviously we've touched on So if there's questions.
Something I saw because it said in actuality that the divorce rate among arranged marriage is not as high as.
Yeah, there's two things. All right, so arranged marriages historically and according to the percentages have a higher percentage of a successful marriage, as in no divorce, than non-arranged. At the same time, the statistics for people inside the church and the statistics for people outside the church are the same. It is. Within 1 or 2 points. Yeah. So just kind of, again, just making statements. I'm not trying to, living with someone is difficult. All right. I mean, I'm dead serious. All right. So don't I mean, don't dress it up to be something that it's not. Okay, I'm dead serious, all right? And because there's so many factors that go in, all right? So it's not just, think about, you've got two autonomous persons. Now, if it's not arranged, then you don't have to worry about any of the histories. You don't have to worry about your families or anything like that. So one of the reasons I would argue that for the statistics of higher success rate among arranged marriages is because there's buy-in to the system from the family unit on the front end, right? So your approach to it is different. And you've got two autonomous persons, but in arranged marriages, it's probably autonomy with an asterisk because it's getting brokered. You got 10 sheep and a couple of goats, and in the Old Testament, that's kind of what it was. Whatever, ma'am.
Your culture was the same. Usually you would pick somebody for your son or daughter that came from a family that you respected
Sure.
and honored.
Right.
So there wasn't as much conflict.
That's right. And you stayed within class most of the time. Those who married out of class were very liberal compared to their day. Now, don't read conservative liberal in what we mean, but liberal as in not the norm. At the same time, those who would marry out of class, at least if your family was in a higher class, economically or whatever, according to that culture in that day, often came with a purpose. You wanted to either unite a house or titles or what have you. Do y'all watch, is it Netflix, The Crown? Is that right? Is it called The Crown? Yeah, all right. So I think that's one of the shows that Brooke watches. And because it has to do with Queen Elizabeth. Now, it's been a long time since I took British history. Elizabeth's father was named what? George. All right. His brother was, and he advocated. For love, right? All right. So there's a modern example of what that's like within the last 100 years, or 100 something years. Do what? Yeah. He basically is persona non grata. He's out the door, cut off. They give him a little bit of money, but at some point even that dries up. So that's a modern approach to where we were at just say a little over 100 years ago, if I had to guess. But so the arranged marriages have a little bit more buy-in on the front end than say those that don't. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be, but we also live with this misunderstanding of love. We think love is Cupid. No, not lust, that it's esoteric, that it controls. Love is not. Love is a choice you make. All right? So, the only way you know that someone loves you is by what? Because you're able to dial in and see something that's four-dimensional, like maybe this fog that's floating around, and you see that in your spouse or your children or whoever it is that you love. Or, I would argue not, or do you perceive that someone is choosing to do and to say certain things that then you equate that to be they love you? I would argue that's, if I went around and I told every last one of you I love you, and then I go and do things that are unloving, I could say, can't you see the green haze that's floating around? And that's what I want you to get. No, the way you interpret love is that it has somewhere to do with word and deed, which then involves a choice. And so we live with a little bit of a different understanding of, at least on the front end of marriage when it comes to love. Now, I'm giving you this is just 100% Shane Green, just what I've observed with watching couples and even in my own life. So which goes back to the point that I made early, that the reason why living with someone is difficult is because the green haze fades quickly. And then he doesn't pick up his clothes. she doesn't put the toilet paper back right. I mean, or who buys the, I mean, you know, so at some point you get into, you know, it's requiring a little bit of work here, you know. I want the green haze where it feels good and it's honeymoon all the time. Well, you know, that lasts for, you know, I've changed the way I do premarital counseling. No, that's serious. I don't do a lot of premarital counseling.
You do it,
Oh, no, I do maybe 1 or 2 sessions at best. And I do whatever is required so they can get the cheaper payment to get their wedding license. But now what they have to do is they have to meet with me in a year. Because I could give them nursery rhymes, and everybody just wants to get married. And they really don't need me. They can go down to the courthouse and get married. All right? So, and early on in my life and practice as a minister, you know, it sounds so wonderful on the front end. Yeah, well, it's perfect. Thank you. Oh, you're helping me. You know, which maybe I am. I don't know. But they don't know what they don't know. And so I do whatever it is that keeps me in grace. We need to edit this, you know. So with, you know, the city. So this, and I'm not lying. I mean, I do meet with them. But what they have to do is, yeah, they require, if you want. All right, so let me wave my white flag because I protest this. I don't think this is fair. And I'm giving you some of the reason why. If you can get a marriage license without any counseling, you just have to pay more. You have to pay more. You can get a marriage license without counseling. You just have to pay a higher fee. Well, now, all right, so I'm not trying to convince you. all right. The reason why we do that is because we want to help couples to the best of our ability because divorce is painful for multiple parties, okay? It's not just a couple, for multiple parties. So the idea is that if we can help couples, we want to help them, all right? So why? Well, let's sort of, with cost, you know, sort of push them into some level of counseling. Good idea. It's not perfect, because what if someone doesn't have accessibility to that? You know, there's multiple reasons why it might not work. My struggle is when Brooke and I were going through, when we were going to get married, it really didn't matter what the preacher told us. We were going to do and say whatever we needed to say so that we could get to February the 18th. All right? So, I mean, you know, and so we did whatever, and it sounded perfect. The moment we checked that box, it all went in the closet. And but, you know, just like any marriage, after a couple of years into this, you know, you got to figure out some stuff. And, you know, and so fortunately, we had people that were throughout periods of our life that were mentors to us that could help us. And I mean, I like to think that Brooke and I are somewhat, you know, smart, and we're able to see things about our life. But what's been helpful to us is that even when it hasn't been the easiest, there was not a fear of commitment. So we just knew that if we stayed at it long enough, however long that would take, eventually we would kind of come out of it. But that was, you know, just like any marriage, it's not easy. Goodness gracious. I mean, it's hard to live with someone with a mutual level of care and respect and what have you, because that requires something of humanity that is not their default place. All right? So we can go back to the text. What makes 9, 10, and 11 so wonderful is the backdrop is God's mercy. Which means that if this is what's required and you only get to this, that somehow God is not going to give up until they do like this. Okay? So I think that also can apply to a marriage. When you have an expectation here and what you're experiencing is this, you will have frustration. Frustration then leads to anger, leads to depression, leads to all kinds of things. And if it's not dealt with over a period of time, it eventually leads to bitterness. Or whatever, you know, and then that's where you get people saying falling out of love and whatever. No, they didn't fall out of love, as if to say they don't have the green haze anymore. What happened is this became their normal. And it was their normal for so long, they can't envision anything other than their normal. Well, you know, I mean, it either the hard work to get to here, or, you know, it's not working. And the good news is that it doesn't mean that if that's the case, that it's the end of life and the end of happiness. I mean, there's life after divorce and what have you. I mean, just like there's life after losing a spouse and things of that nature. It's not ideal. I mean, no one signs up in the front end and says, gosh, I'd like to do that again, right? I mean, because it's painful. But part of life, what's inherent to life, is levels of pain. And, the great thing about God and the great thing about our faith is that when this is either what is expected and this is the reality, you're not alone. All right? So Romans 8, the end of chapter 8, then in Romans 9, 10, and 11 is that, if everybody else gives up, God hasn't given up. All right? So this applies more than just the theological theater of let's just talk about theology. This becomes real life for us, because theology is made to be applied. And the good news is that there are, God doesn't quit. Now there's a time process when it comes to either acceptance and growth and what have you, but the game's not over. And then when you talk about post-death, which we don't have as much information on. God's love and care doesn't, think about heaven, think about transformation, full transformation, glorification, all that stuff. So you see written into the cards with God is something that is far greater than the masses of how we approach things. Who started this, all right? So, how do we get on arranged marriages? So anyways, so we live in a different day when it comes to how we don't have a lot of arranged marriages inside of our culture. And that's probably some good and some bad as well.
Some of them would have been better.
Well, it's statistically speaking. Obviously, if arranged marriages as a whole seem to, on the masses, tick a little higher than those, that doesn't mean every arranged marriage is as happy. So some of the data is, did someone get divorced or somebody not get divorced? You can still be married and be divorced as well. And ultimately what we would want is fulfillment in life and levels of joys and happiness that come with that, and which takes work. Just so even if someone's married, takes work. Someone's not married, takes work. It's what's Irenaeus, if you really want to do some reading on this, 120 AD, writes about the maturation of faith process. And the way he likens it to, when we start, what happens from being born, a baby and then eventually into adult. He says there's a level of life maturation that takes place as well. And the goal is to get to full adult, not just physically, but in just way of life. And a lot of times he talks about faith, the faith journey along those same lines, which means that, maturing in any level has growing pains. When Connor, in one summer when he went from, this height to 6 inches taller in 3 months, he had growing pains. His legs hurt all the time. Well, sometimes the growing pains aren't physical. So, all righty. Real quick, verse 7. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest was hardened. As it is written, God gave them to a sluggish spirit, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and keep their backs forever bent. Now, I want to say a word real quick about divine sovereignty and then human responsibility. Because often, and we've talked a little bit about this, that's where we get the whole concept around free will, predestination, at the same time, election versus, non-election. And what we see in this passage, and I would say this is also in line with what shows up in the larger scope of the Bible, there's a balance of divine sovereignty and human responsibility in this particular passage. Part of what's being talked about are on equal notions, this idea of God's elect, and then this concept of deliberate hardening of maybe human will or human heart, and how that plays into human striving and efforts to obtain something. So you have a little bit of that shows up in the text. What Paul does not say is that Israel was hardened first so that then they were made to fail. All right, so you got to see which one comes first and then what's the causation of it. Those who failed first, they did not obtain it on their own responsibility, on their own effort. Those who failed God did not do so because they had been hardened in the first place. They were hardened after they failed. That's what we have in the text. Paul's not talking about eternal decrees of hardening of hearts akin to being an eternal reprobate. Because when we get to 11:25, that is chapter 11, verse 25, he's going to talk about Israel's hardening is only temporary. So it's not eternal decrees throughout all time and what have you. I mean, he quotes Deuteronomy here, he quotes Isaiah, a little bit of the Psalms. And all of this is the idea of if someone tells me, Shane, if you do A, that's going to lead to B. So if I do A, violation of law, of God's will, that's going to lead to B. So part of B then has my own, what does it mean to live now in a state of B? Which then makes it easier for me to do C. All right, does that make sense? Talk about people who, maybe the best way to see this is people who struggle with addictions. All right? So have a life, no addictive behavior. Do something that creates an addictive behavior. All right, so now that they started at A, something happens, now they're at B, they live with the causations of being with B, which then makes it easier to go deeper down that hole of addiction, right? All right, so then from that state of B, move to C, move to D, on down the line. Now, Paul's not talking about addictive behaviors as much as he's talking about Israel by the masses, not every single one in Israel, so he's talking generally. Starts here. They do something that puts them in a state of where they're violating of will. All right, I already talked about that throughout the history of the Old Testament and in previous chapters in the book of Romans. Because of that, then it makes it easier for them to move to C, to D, and what have you. And God, like what we talked about in Romans chapter 1, at A, did B, now live as a causation of living with a B. So then you follow that down further down the line. And God then allows the person to live into the consequences that they've made. You with me? All right, that's what he's getting at here. So when we talk about hardening of heart, and we compare that to predestination and what that looks like with hardening of heart, does God cause hardening of heart, which then leads down the rabbit hole, or do people make a response or make a choice, and then God allows them to live into the consequences of their actions? The wording that is used in the Old Testament and the New Testament is the living into the actions. The way the Bible describes that is the hardening process. But what you don't find here or in other parts of Old Testament, New Testament, is that God puts them in a state of B first and not at a state of A. So if God caused them to be B first, then allows them to live into the actions, that would be then God causing them to go down the rabbit trail. It's not what he's talking about here. Start at A, make a decision, human responsibility, human choice to make a decision. God allows the consequences of that, which one of the consequences is a hardening process. So you take people who struggle with addictions. Start at A, do something. B, creates an addictive behavior, what have you. Well, what's one of the effects of people who live with addictions, or at least what can be, is they spiral down, and even in the face of hurting someone else, they'll still do that, right? Hardening process. Same thing here. All right? So I just wanted to clarify some of that. Does that make sense? If it's not, we still have 2 minutes. You know, we can really make it clear. Yes, ma'am. Ooh. All right. So let me. All right. So I'm going to ask you what you mean by that. Israel hardened first. Is that God made Israel harden, which then caused them to fail, or Israel, the free agent, hardened themselves, which then made them to fail? Tell me what you mean by what you wrote down. Okay. Yeah, so, yeah. Well, I mean, what I've been arguing is that Israel made the first action. All right. So it which then leads to a hardening process.
Mine calls that God gave them a dull spirit so they could neither see nor hear.
Right. What version of the Bible do you have?
That little one comedy is,
The C. Okay. Yeah. Theologically speaking, the issue of first step is not with God. All right. So some of it is the language. I mean, when you go from Greek to English, it's not always the word. I mean, the translations don't always work out, in a good translation. So if you see this inside the context of it, you'll see first action Israel, and then God allows that. All right. So sluggish, whatever. Same the addictive personality or the addictive behavior. I mean, sluggish would be maybe a word that we could use as well. What I don't want you to draw from the text is God started them at B and then made them go all the way down to wherever letter they're at. Without any human responsibility whatsoever. That you cannot justify with the text. Pharaoh, remember we were looking at Exodus? It says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, often we think that Pharaoh was this neutral agent who, was kind of an innocent bystander. I mean, Pharaoh was not. He didn't start at B, C, D, E, or F. I mean, he was already there. And so God allowed the slope that he was on to continue. I didn't change that. But the idea that thinks that people are just without any human responsibility or what have you, you can't get that from the text. I mean, there is human responsibility, and at the same time, God allowing the repercussions of their actions to continue, and what that plays into the life and the practice of Israel. All right? We good? All right, so now no meeting in here next week. Remember, we'll be at the Holy Week lunches, and then we'll pick back up for this group specifically the week after. All right? We meet, if you want to come to the Holy Week lunches, you can, but there is no official meeting of this group. All right? Go in peace.